Hello everyone! Today we have a very special guest. Her name is April Wright and she is an award-winning director. And today she's here to talk about her new film, All Skate. Enjoy! This All Skate seemed like it's always been a strong passion project for you, kind of underlying as you've been making your other films. So could you kind of go into what made you want to make this movie? Like, why this movie, and why did has this kind of always been lingering on your mind?
So I'll give a slight bit of context first. First off, just on documentaries. There's all different types of documentaries, as you know, and I'm somebody who I would not know how to make a documentary about, whatever, trafficking, political things, heavy documentaries. There's so many social issue documentaries, heavy documentaries. And when I was younger, I saw this movie that Penelope Spheris developed, The Decline of Western Civilization, Part 2, The Metal Years. And for some reason, I saw this in a theater. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, you can make documentaries that are cool and on cool topics, because this was about the whole situation of rock and roll, especially in Los Angeles in the 80s when you were starting to have this hair metal thing. And of course, off of that, she got to direct Wayne's World. And I like that part too, because I also like narrative projects as well as documentaries. And a lot of big filmmakers have done both. So I was kind of looking at that. And when I started making films, there was a genre film that I'd written, like a horror film that was being made. And at around there, I was thinking about directing, and I was writing other things. And I was also doing the research for my first documentary about drive-in movies. And so to put in context, so that's kind of the thing. I like to make documentaries about, fun, cool topics. But I think I also put a lot of social subtext within my films, but it's just sort of in there within the fun topic. So I don't know how to make heavy docs. I make fun docs, but they definitely have things for the audience to chew on and think about and activate them. And I have, points of view that I'm trying to share, and that I'm trying to share on behalf of the people in the film and what their films and what they're doing. So this one in particular, my family's business growing up was a roller rink. So I grew up on skates. And I didn't want to make this documentary first because because it is personal. And so I wanted to do it right. But I did go to drive-ins all the time growing up in the same area. And it was something that there were less and less of them. And I didn't understand why, because we still love cars. We still love movies. What could have happened? So I wanted to dive into that deeper. So I made that one first. Now I have 4 documentaries that are out into the world, and I had been shooting this one actively for about 5 years now, the roller skating one. And I've also been shooting B-roll for one about the history of bowling alleys and the history of mom and pop amusement parks, because before everything became Disney and Six Flags, there were little amusement parks all over the country. And then, so I'd been shooting B-roll for all those, and then finally it was like, I think the skating one is coming to the top of the list. And skating's having a moment and a resurgence that's been happening since COVID. So long way around an answer, but I think, for anybody thinking about making documentaries, that's kind of the thing. Like, think about what kind you want to make. If there's a topic that grabs you, it has to be something that you care about and that you're into, because it takes many years. So that's kind of how I look at it.
It makes so much sense. Not to mention, this stuff is hard, It's not easy making a film. And another thing I want to commend you on for All Skate, I got to see you at the Lake County Film Festival. I'm watching that, and I'm going, she did a lot of work to pull this movie off. I mean, the amount of even just like archival footage, archival photos, posters. Wasn't just like, hey, let's throw one up or 2 up and let it linger. It was like a ton of research and application. So maybe you could go into that side of things too. Like, yes, you have to be strong and passionate on a subject, because it takes years and a lot of work, and you have to have that care factor. But you go into as well the right way to approach it in preparation,
Mhm.
things like that.
Okay. So another way I look at it, I think, every topic that you're doing, you definitely have to approach it with respect. And it's also, when I was first thinking about making documentaries, another filmmaker told me this, that you want to tell the story from the inside out. And I think he was absolutely right about that. And it's been a guiding thing for me, that it's like, we're making a movie, but for some people, it's their lives and their livelihoods. And so you don't want to be an outsider picking this topic and just like, here's what I think about it from the outside. You have to get on the inside and get to know those people. And once you do, you just have to listen, because they will tell you what's important. They will tell you this person should be in your documentary. That happened for All Skate. I got referred to this guy, Jim Turner, who is a skating coach. He was one of the founders of the National Roller Skating Museum, and he still skates and still coaches, even though he's probably about 80 years old or more. And I went to a rink in Milwaukee to film him. When I was there, I was telling people, I really want to show Chicago skater, somebody who does the Chicago JB style and other things. Since I'm from this area, that was important to me. And everybody kept telling me, you have to speak to this woman, Maisha McCaskill. Everybody kept saying, she's the best skater in Chicago. You need to talk to her. And so I reached out to her, and it worked out. And she's in the film, and she's fantastic. And she's always teaching and spreading the love of skating. And so once you get involved with that community, I've had to do that for drive-ins in that topic. I've had to do that for historic theaters. When I made my documentary about movie palaces, I had to do that with Hollywood Stuntwomen when I was making that documentary about them. You have to get to know them, respect them, and hear what's important, and let them help you shape what it is, because they know who should be telling the story. They know who they respect. So for me with All Skate, it was interesting because even though I grew up in a roller rink and it's so much part of my identity to be a skater, to be, they call us rink rats, people that spend their time in roller rinks. Um, it's always been part of my life. It's definitely how I grew up. My first job, my cousin and I worked at the snack bar. We first got $1 an hour, and then once we knew what we were doing and had proven our value, we talked our grandpa into giving us $2 an hour. And just learned so much growing up there about you know having integrity and how you talk to people and approach people, because you're dealing with the public. You're trying to create this atmosphere that's a safe haven and a friendly place for kids, and helping almost raise the kids in the neighborhood. And so there's a lot of obligation to the community in that business. I think drive-ins have the same thing, by the way, and so do these art house and movie palaces that are still around. They're all parts of the community, so there is a common thread there. But even though I grew up in that and I knew that and it had shaped so much who I was, there were a lot of aspects I didn't know. I did not know that inline skates, like rollerblade style, were the first skates. I thought those came along in the 80s. I thought that was the first time anybody had seen them. But the first skates were inline. Amazing.
Yeah.
um, and I also had not really focused on the roller sports side of it. My cousin had done a little bit of that as a result of her helping me with the film. She went back to competitive skating. She just did a meet a few days ago. She got a bronze medal, I think, or a silver medal for one of the competitions there. And so the movie kind of makes you inspired, I think. Like when I made the drive-in one, people were like, I have to go support my drive-ins, or I want to own a drive-in. And I think this one, even from that special screening that we had last week at Lake County Film Festival, even though the movie's not 100% done, there's still things I have to finish up on it. But so many people have followed up afterwards that they're, finding what rinks are near me. Let's all go skating. Let's make this part of what we're doing. Let's, find and support these places. So that's good if you can inspire people. And so, yeah, it inspired my cousin while we were making it. And there was just a lot I learned. I didn't know that much about speed skating and the history of that, the first speed skating meet was in the 30s. who would have known? You know, there were just so many things that I found out making the film that I didn't know. So I learned a lot as well.
That's interesting too, because we had a little discussion after the film, and for me, like looking at like when you're editing someone's interview, right, and you're going through that, you have like your own process where you kind of, you know, you bring up a maybe a subject or topic, but you were saying you don't have a pre-planned questions, you know, that everybody would have. I think it's important to incite uniqueness from each interview, but it's still obviously within that cohesive
Mm-hmm.
atmosphere of it. How do you approach interviewing somebody and bringing that up so you get some special things out of it as well?
Mm-hmm. First off, I do as much research as I can. So I just go everywhere, books, everywhere online, and try to piece together the story and what the key aspects are of the story and what I want to cover. And then I start thinking about, well, who do I want to interview? Like there might be some people who stand out, but what I try to do, I map out my documentaries the same way that you would a feature film. So on a feature film structure, you have something opening to let people know the world that they're in and kind of catch their attention. And then you have an inciting incident, something that is like, oh, this is intriguing. Now I've got to follow this journey. You have to have an act break where you shift into something different for your act two. You have to have a midpoint where, you know, something switches. You have to have your dark part at the end of act two where it feels like everything's lost. And then you have some sort of final statement and sort of opportunity and hope at the end. So I do map it like that. After researching a topic for my documentary, I do think about what are those key tentpole beats that are really important. And so, for example, in the story of the history of skating, when rollerblades came along, and it was actually in the 80s that this very young kid who played hockey discovered old designs for inline skates that actually Chicago Skate Company owned. And he kind of reintroduced that idea. That really changed skating. That was a big thing. It wasn't just the skates, it was part of that culture of the 80s and 90s and the neon clothes and, you know, sort of this idea that you could be on skates and do some of the same tricks that you might have seen people doing, like on a BMX bike or something. You know, it was kind of brought it into this whole different world, and it really reinvigorated skating. So I knew that that had to be one of the markers along the way. For example, the disco era, huge, huge, huge for skating. And you know, so many celebrities skating, and you know, every TV show that was in the 70s when that happened, Charlie's Angels or Chips or whatever, they all had their roller disco episodes. So I knew that was a mile marker along the way. So you kind of map those things out. And I literally do it like you would for a feature film. So I map out the structure and I use index cards. Kind of what are those key story beats that I want to cover. So then I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, who's going to tell this story for me? And it's two pieces that you want somebody verbally to tell the story, and then you need to have enough images to support what they're saying, especially when it's historic. If you're doing a documentary that's unfolding in the present, then you're following the subject around and things are happening. When you're doing something in history, you have to figure out what are the visuals. If there aren't good visuals, you see techniques in documentaries where they might use animation or recreations or things like that. So that's something to always be thinking about when it's historic is what do I have available to me in terms of old photos and archival clips and that type of thing. In the case of All Skate, in like the 90s and that era, my brother had a camcorder. He was one of the first people that had one of those. And so I knew there was footage from that era for my family's rink. And then I knew there was some footage of rinks depicted in different movies and things like that, especially in that disco era. And then just kind of searching online for even older stuff before that.
Hmm.
And some of it was like in the Library of Congress. So you're kind of thinking about how do I marry that? And then you're also deciding, am I going to have a narrator or is everybody in the story just going to tell the story? And for this one, I realized I didn't need a narrator per se because everybody was telling pieces of the story. And I also realized I didn't need a historian, even though it was a history story. Like for my first drive-in documentary, Going Attractions, the definitive story of the American drive-in movie, I literally had a sociologist, a professor from USC, who talked about a lot of the social context of things that were going on, because you needed that backdrop to understand all the things that happened to drive-ins that were sort of unrelated to the movies. And so I had a historian, and I definitely had historians in my Movie Palace documentary. But when I got to this one, I realized all these skaters know the history really well. They all started talking about their history. Each person was very well aware of what came before them and what had happened. And that was really unique. And then when you put on top of that, that I had my perspective and my family's history, that became one of the through lines, because my grandpa was in the skating business starting in the 40s. He had a tent rink, and then he built his first roller rink. And then the rink that I grew up in, he built in the 50s. So he was building in that post World War II suburban growth era where a lot of rinks were built, and they were family owned businesses. And we got to over 5,000 of them after World War II. So, mine was just one of those 5,000, but it's a story that everybody who had a rink or went to a rink, they can see their own rink in our story. And so that's how I kind of shaped it. And as you're picking the people, you're mapping the story beats across the top. And like I said, I literally put index cards of what those key beats are in the topics. And then you're like, who really knows this topic? And I try to make sure each person I'm putting in the film can be an expert or just really shine in a certain topic. When you're going back to that person and hearing them, you're like, oh, that's the person that, their rink is from the 1900s. So they know that aspect of the history very well. They've been around the longest. Or the Guptill's Arena, they're the world's largest roller rink in the Guinness Book. When we go back to him, you're like, oh yeah, okay, we're in the world's largest rink again. That's his perspective. His grandfather built it. And so you want to, as you're going through, you want to kind of have those touch points where you're like, oh, that's that person, that's that person, that's that person. Their perspective, and then it helps you kind of piece that together. But each person has a unique aspect of that timeline that they're going to shine, they're going to know the most. And so that's how I structure it, trying to make sure that there's a balance. And I also, balance is important too. Like I try to get different people, different ages, different, men, women, different colors, different, rich, poor, whatever those variables are in every documentary. I want to tell as many sides of the story as I can. So you're trying to get different types of people so that you're balancing out all the points of view. And what I found consistently in most of my stuff is once you start talking to people, none of those factors matter. People very shortly start telling you all the same things. It happened in my last movie, Back to the Drive-In, when I was visiting all these drive-ins kind of coming out of COVID. And I really thought, older drive-ins, newer drive-ins, red states, blue states. I thought all these things would be a factor, and it wasn't at all. Everybody started telling me the exact same things, exact same good things, exact same why they're doing it, exact same challenges. And it was like, we're more alike than different. And for skating, it was the same too. The way that people feel like it's so important for their communities, for the kids, that it's an expression of freedom, and that it's just spreading the love of skating, how skating is so inclusive. Everybody kept saying the same thing. So,
And I think too. I mean, you also have, and actually, the first part of your career, it seems like a lot of narrative side of storytelling and filmmaking, and then you start getting into the documentary. So you do both. I mean, you're a filmmaker. You do both. And maybe you can kind of juxtapose between filmmaking wise, narrative versus documentary, because, and I love hearing that because you're doing a cinematic documentary storytelling, so that's going to have like your act 1, your act 2, your act 3, and it's not dissimilar at all from narrative, but there are some differences. And I suppose while you're kind of juxtaposing between making two narrative versus documentary, we can go on the documentary side heavier as well on, okay, how am I finding the backbone of this story? Am I doing that beforehand? Is that happening pretty much in the rough cut and post? And obviously, you probably have surprises along the way too, where, hey, I thought this story was going to go this way beforehand, but you get this magic that happens as you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
they're going to say this person, you should have this person in there. So keep going to narrative versus documentary filmmaking, but let's lean towards we're talking about documentaries primarily today.
Yeah, these are great questions, Tom.
Yeah.
So again, I'm a filmmaker who gets driven by subjects that I'm interested in. And I really like true stories, and I really like kind of underdog stories. So even looking at my documentaries, the stunt women in this heavily testosterone field, they're kind of the underdogs, but they persevere. The drive-ins, they're the underdogs of the film industry. They've persevered in many ways. Roller rinks, kind of the same thing. They're family-owned businesses. They're, whatever they are. And so things inspired by true stories. And even in my narrative stuff, very often the nugget that starts me to write a script or to find a topic I'm interested in is very often inspired by a real event that happened or a real person that causes me to do the same kind of thing that I do for a doc, to look into that, to research it and kind of see what's there. And then I just kind of, and sometimes I've had ideas where I'm like, is this a documentary? Could this be a series? Is this a feature? What's the format? I haven't had anything made yet for TV, but I've written stuff that people have been looking at. And for my features, I did kind of start all at the same time, like writing genre stuff. And very shortly after, I directed my first feature. And I also was researching my documentary and traveling to shoot that, my first one that was about drive-in. So I kind of started doing them all at once. Now, there's a cost thing that you can kind of do documentaries for less than you can a feature film. And so there's aspects of it that you can just start doing also on your own. So like when I made my documentary Back to the Drive-In, I went on the road myself. So I just had a 4K Canon camera, I had a GoPro, and I had a drone. And with those things, I could get aerials of the drive-ins. I could set the GoPro to show the time lapse day to night, the drive-in empty to full. And then I could verite, go around and follow the owners and shoot. And between those, I had plenty to cut. Through making documentaries, I've learned how to edit. So I I edited that one myself. But then there's certain things that you need money. You have to have a legal review, your score. You either need to find music or get people to write score. Color correction, you can do a lot yourself, but if you really want a very polished, complete look, you want a professional to do that. The mix, the sound design. There's certain things that I have to work with others, but I can get it way down the road, like you saw the other day. That cut of All Skate, even though it doesn't have all those things finished, I can get it to a very good version to show people. And then at some point you can start to maybe even talk to buyers or investors to finish it up, or crowdfunding, or whatever you do. So the more you learn, the more you do it, the more you learn. And I got forced into learning how to edit on my very first documentary, which took probably 8 years total, to kind of get it edited and out into the world. And having those skills helps me know how to do the shooting, because you know what you're going to do with it later. So I'm thinking about structure. Now back to the drive-in, that one was completely verite. I just knew I was going to go visit drive-ins. I didn't know what would happen. I knew the basic function of drive-ins and how they work. I knew some of the challenges they were having during COVID, but I was really following them, and I didn't know what the ultimate structure was going to be. I ended up structuring it as one long night, where we sort of jump cut around throughout the beats of the night, and go to each of the drive-ins that we're visiting to see what each one is dealing with. Now, even there, each one was dealing with something different. So again, kind of thinking about how are you creating a story about it. One had fog rolling in, which might impact the show. One had a band setting up what was going to happen there. Each one had different things. One had just opened 3 weeks before I got there. They were brand new and dealing with all of that. So each one had a different story and a different perspective. So sometimes you are looking for that, even though, but a lot going in. And you have an idea of what it's going to be. And especially when you do a historic one, there's not that moment where it takes a different direction. Unless I was doing a historic one and I realized this person in it has their story is so unique they could be their own separate documentary. Sure, that can happen. But when you're doing history, the story's there. It's the history. So you're not getting what you are with more of a verite present day unfolding documentary where the story, something happens in a court case, there's a ruling, or this comes out, like that happens a lot in documentaries that are, present day unfolding, where the story goes a direction that you couldn't see coming. But in history, if you've done your research, you kind of know. Now, you won't know the specific stories people are going to tell you. Like, I'll give you an example. That professor I was talking about before from USC, I'm sitting there in the middle of her interview, and then she starts telling me, oh yeah, and there was a point in time when my dad lived by a drive-in and we could see the screen. And I'm like, she never told me any of that in the previews. When I had talked to her about the topics I wanted to cover, that she had such a personal connection and memories. So that was wonderful to discover. So there are things you discover. You don't know what they're going to tell you. But in terms of the overall flow of the story, you basically know because you've done your research. And to circle back to one thing you said before about the questions, I do ask people different questions. There's some overall questions I might ask everyone. I might ask that if they have a personal connection or a memory about it. I might ask them what they do remember so that I get some personal stories to put up front. And I might ask them what they think the future of this topic is. How do you feel about it? Where are we heading? Because I like to kind of aim towards the future in the end. So I might ask everybody those two things. But when I'm getting into the meat, like I would not ask about rollerblades, for example. Somebody who's talking about that sensation, I probably wouldn't ask them what it was like when rinks opened in the 1800s. You know what I'm saying? Like, those are going to be different people with different expertise. And so that's why you're like, oh, who can cover this topic? Who knows this topic of skating in the early days in the 1800s? It's the guy who was a co-founder of the National Roller Skating Museum, because he did all that research and published books on it. So he knows that topic. Okay, great. Now I've got that covered. So these are the things that you're always trying to juggle.
It's so interesting because like sometimes, I mean, on your end, and you're hearing what the interviewees saying back, sometimes you're like, okay, that's kind of not the direction that you thought that was going to go. Sometimes you get surprised with great things. And honestly, I guess that's the next thing I want to go into. What if they go through a whole story and it is lackluster and it is not the right dynamic? Now, I want to emphasize, I've done over 300 interviews doing podcasting and documentaries and things like that. There's ways to, like, as a director, I suppose, go, hey, let's go back to that again, but pick up these pieces. How do you like to approach that? Because you don't want to, obviously I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want this organic response, but there's also a such thing as you're digging too much in an area that may not have any ground. So how do you like to approach a given topic that you're like, wow, this really, it's important, especially from this person. Like you said, they did the museum side of things. It's important for us to dive into this, but you feel like you're not really, as a director, how do you handle that as a director? You're not really getting the best performance out of them, I suppose.
Such a good question. So what I do, like I said, I try to do my research and then figure out the type of people I need to cover each topic, and that balance and mix of different people, different voices, and different perspectives. So I'm looking at both of those things. And so then what I'll do is I'll try to, again, tell the story from the inside out. Am I getting to the right people who's telling me to talk over, check into this person. So when I get those referrals, I'm looking into those people, who they are, what they might know. When I contact them, I'll tell them I'm making a thing on this topic, and I'll say, I think you know a lot about this. Would you feel comfortable talking about this? So I will tell them the areas, why I think they're a good fit, where I think. Now, that doesn't mean when I get to the interview that I might ask, do you know anything about the roller disco era? Do you remember that at all? Like even if they're younger, I'll be like, would you remember seeing that on TV? Did that leave an impression? Like, I might spread out and just be like, do you remember that? And sometimes they'll say, no, I don't have a memory like that, or I don't feel like I have any expertise on that, and that's fine. But I will tell them, because some people might want to refresh their memory on stories or anecdotes, or even double check their research so that they are prepared to talk about the topics I want to give them. And I will give them a written outline. So I'll show them, like, these are the 5 or 7 things. Like, it's not a long interview. I'll just be like, these are like the 5 topics I want to talk to you about, where I think you know something, so that they feel comfortable going into it. I'm not just hitting anybody cold. So that helps a lot. And then, again, you have to listen to people and the stories that they feel are important. Like I said earlier, that you want to tell the story from the inside out. So you always want to hear their story. You always want to see what it is, because that's the part where, even though you know the history, you might not totally realize this person brings it up, and then the next person I interview, 5 months later, they brought that up too. Okay, this is a thing, and I'm seeing dots connect. So there might be things like that, where they've told you something that doesn't seem important at the time because you're not an insider like they are. And then you start to realize, oh gosh, everybody's bringing up this thing I didn't think was that important. So
Yeah.
you do have to look out for stuff like that. But I try to tell people, what we're going to talk about. And then the other thing I do is I try not to have anything separate me and that person. So when I was shooting Back to the Drive-In and I had the camera myself, I would either have it up here or I would have it here, and I would just be talking to them, looking at them, even though I had them in frame in the camera right here. When I shoot sit-down interviews, I don't do those verite generally. Sometimes if I get caught somewhere and I don't have a crew and somebody is great, I will verite interview them the best I can. I've done that many times. But if I'm scheduling a sit down interview, I work with a DP, because I want them with 2 cameras and I want them nicely lit. And so I definitely do that. And in those cases, I'm not behind the camera. I'm sitting in a chair directly in front of the person. I'm just off camera, and I'm basically having a conversation. And that's what I always tell them too. We're just going to have a conversation. The camera's going to catch it, but it shouldn't feel like that to the person. It should just more feel like they're having a conversation with me. And subjects have told me that they get surprised with what they're telling me. Like, because it feels so easy and we're just having a conversation. And so they're being really honest and telling me how they feel. And I think doing that kind of style, where it's just about me and them and the conversation that we're having, and I'm engaging with them like a conversation, it's not like question, answer, okay, cut, next question. No, I'm going, wow, that's great. I love that story. And did you do this? And then they're elaborating. So that's how I'm getting the good stuff out of them, is because we're having a real conversation, and then the camera's just picking that up. So that's how I approach that.
I mean, that's more organic and natural. You interview enough people. Most people, they're nervous because there's cameras. It's not normal. And if people are used to cameras in front of them, they're used to doing it more for marketing purposes, or for their business or
They're
whatnot. So
putting
you get
on
like
something instead of just
right.
being.
It's interesting because otherwise, you talk to pretty much anybody, and whether they're putting on or they're nervous or putting on a face or whatever, or even guarded. Some people are just guarded on the thing, or some people it's like, hey, this is a really
Right.
tumultuous subject, and they're like just kind of like robotically talking because it might be decades that bad thing happened. But usually around, I feel like around like that 20-30 minute marker, people just, because it's conversational, they just kind of relax. And then, right, you get the good stuff, because it's more real.
I think you can I found you can get to that marker faster. Part of it is that pre-interview, kind of saying these are the topics I want to talk to you about, and here it is written. So then by the time you're sitting down with them, there's already a little bit of rapport. They know who you are. So I try to engage and do a pre-interview, make them part of what I'm going to ask them so that they're not surprised, and that helps. People will always have something that they want to tell you, that they want to make sure they say this. There's always that. Like, this is how I, this is the thing I rehearse, this is the thing I want to say. That's great. It could be the most important thing. But I think the other thing too, I will start with the easier questions first. Like I was just saying, I will start with do you remember going to the roller rink? Do you have any personal stories? Is there anything that left an impression? I did that with one of the subjects in the documentary you saw, Harry, who was running the roller wave in Brooklyn, and he starts telling me how he went to this rink and he had his first date there, and he held the girl's hand and they skated around 5 times. Like, that's the level of detail in a story that you're like, young Harry remembers they skated around 5 times. That's how important that was to him. Not 6 times, not, like,
Yeah.
that was burned in his brain. So you get those little personal things. And if you start more conversationally with some of those things than the structured questions, that can open the door to making it feel like a conversation really early. Because you're not, it's low pressure. It's just, do you remember anything like that? And and it's not structured. It's just whatever comes to mind for them, or maybe they'll think of something later. So yeah, there's definitely things you can do to make people feel more comfortable and to get to the stories. There was another person in All Skate, Dominic, who is a famous roller rink organist, and he owns the Moonlight Rollerway in Los Angeles. And he's never done an interview like this in my film. He's had little tiny short pieces done on him because he's owned that for years, but he wasn't sure about being in front of camera. He was uncomfortable. And I talked to other people there at the rink, and I talked to him and sat down with him and told him about my family and showed him some pictures. And he's like, that looks just like our rinks. Like, he could see I was family. I had the same love of it and the same thing. So then he felt better, but then I still couldn't get scheduled with him. He still seemed nervous, even though he knew it was going to be okay. And then I had this idea. So I put him in the film with this other person, Charles Phoenix. Charles Phoenix had done a couple of skate shows there. And so they had a respect and a friendship. And Charles professionally does shows about Americana and history and, roller skating being one of those things. And I talked to other people at the rink. I was like, why don't we put Charles here with Dominic? Then they can talk together. And then I can interview Charles first, and he can see how it is, and he can, feel like he's not alone. And for him, that ended up being the right tactic. So sometimes I have put people together to have conversations on screen, because if they did something together, or if they are going to banter off each other, and that's good. You'll see that in a lot of my films where I have people together and not just single talking head, because that way you're not only going to hear the information, but you're going to see these other pieces of how they interact to tell the story. So that's another good technique too.
Yeah, I've seen that too. Some people, they feel better with that, having another person there, or you get more interesting stories because that's part of the dynamic.
They feed off each other. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes that can get out of hand. So
Yeah.
okay, so for documentary filmmaking versus narrative, of course, you got this recipe from the script, right? You got script, you shoot it, that's second stage, and then the third stage of the story or script is the editing. Whereas documentary filmmaking, you have an outline. That's very important to have something going into that. Your script is like kind of like what, like the rough cut or the assembly, even. Let's kind of approach that side of things, because you're versed very well on both sides. How are you approaching writing a narrative script compared to storytelling wise, and taking the audience? That's the other thing, like stranding that through, taking us on this journey from beginning to end of narrative versus a documentary.
Yeah, so I think that's also a good question. You really thought about this. Well, I know you told me you're making a documentary or two, so you've been thinking about this
Well,
yourself.
I'm living it now. So
I I think the editing in documentaries is a whole different thing. And the reason why, even if you're very smart about what you're shooting and how much and you have a structure and all that, you always have way more footage in a documentary. And if you're talking about a historic subject, you also have archival photos, footage, all those things. And you need to make sure those things can be cleared, are okay by fair use standards. So there's always variables in terms of what can end up in the final thing. And there's different ways that it can go. And you just have a lot more footage. So you have a lot more options. And like you said, with a narrative film, you have a script, you've maybe shot multiple takes, but it's not like you've shot whole different scenes. That, you might have some scenes that don't make
yeah,
it into it, but for a documentary, there's a lot of stories and scenes that won't make it into it. And sometimes I've seen documentaries where they've shot entire interviews that don't make it into it. So establishing that structure once you have the footage, even though you have a plan going in, you still need to figure out how does this cohesively go together in the best way. I think editing in documentaries is a lot harder just because you have a lot more footage and a lot more possible topics and things that could be included. I think it is much more challenging. But even though I have an
yeah.
outline plan going into the documentary very carefully, choosing the mix of people and who's going to know which topic. So there's a lot I know. But then I go in and I start working on the edit and I try to pull like the most interesting stuff and then I start to string that into the topic outline I've done. And then I kind of narrow it down from there. But one of the things, again, when you're talking about the story beats of a narrative structure, those are there to help engage humans in understanding the story. And that's why sometimes when people do non-traditional structures, sometimes those movies get attention because you're thrown off of what's happening. And they always say you need to know the rules to break the rules or whatever. But when you're looking at a regular structure, because you have the opening to grab you, when you think about that, that's emotion engagement. Like, oh, I'm intrigued, I'm interested, so how can I get the audience emotionally to feel that? When there's some inciting incident, some aspect of it that starts you more on the journey and you switch into act two. And when you're having sort of these mile markers in the story, those are emotional mile markers for the audience. And so the reason that you have sort of that dip, when things seem like they're lost, I try to put that emotional piece like you have in a narrative story in the documentaries. So I'm looking for what is the beat where it seems most lost? When does it seem like these drive-ins are all being torn down and they're not going to come back, or the movie palaces are going away, or the roller rinks are having a downturn? And so you want the audience to feel that. And then when you have your bright spots and you're coming back up, then you want them to feel that too. And so for me, the way that you're doing that is the same way that you're writing a script and engineering a narrative story, is for that emotional engagement and flow that the audience is having. And so what I try to do is make sure, just like in a narrative structure, that you have things that are being set up early in the documentary that will have payoff later on. I'll skate because I have my family's rink. I had all the footage, so I could do this a lot. I could show the pictures of our rink being built. I could show my brother's movies from the 80s and 90s. And then I could show you what it became today. And throughout the stories, I kind of do that so you have full arcs. And I do this in all my films, setups and payoffs. So how are you going to engage people emotionally? How are you going to get those emotional reactions? Because you're not just giving information, but you're showing that within this journey that they're taking with you to learn about this subject. So it's like you get attached to this rink. You saw it in its heyday. or this drive-in or whatever. You see these pictures, like how could anything happen? And then, then I'm going to show you that same rink or that same drive-in getting torn down. Now you're like crushed. I cared about that place. Now this. Oh, but wait, now somebody's building a new one, because they want it to be like this one. This happened in the All Skate. Harry in Brooklyn grew up in Empire Rink. Empire Rink closed. It became a storage facility. The community protested it. They didn't win. He thought there was going to be no more skating. So when he created his roller wave rink, he wanted it to feel like Empire. And when people came there, they told him, this reminds me of Empire. And that was like his dream. So now we're in on this emotional journey with him because we know Empire was the birthplace of roller disco. It was a special rink. And he went there and the community tried to save it. And now he's trying to recreate that experience for people. It makes me sad just hearing that story right now as I'm telling the beats. So these are the things that you want to do is you want to think about what are those little mini arcs? What are the setups and payoffs that are going to deliver emotionally for the audience? And so you're kind of making them care about it by how you're structuring it and where you're putting things in the same way when you're writing a narrative script that you're writing setups and payoffs for your characters. I'm doing the same thing when I do a documentary, even if it's a historic documentary.
That makes all the sense in the world because I mean that right. You have the plots like what's taking place, but the story is like why we care, and that's what really entices us throughout the whole film.
Yes, what you just said. Yeah, the plot and then the why do we care? Exactly. That's 100% right. And when you're looking at, narrative things, I always feel like the hero has an exterior journey, which is like, I need to achieve this, I need to complete this, I need to win this, I need to beat this bad guy, whatever that is. But then there's always this emotional journey for the character, which is, like you said, why do we care? That is, if they, if Rocky defeats Apollo Creed, it means he's not just a bum from the neighborhood. And then the outcome, he doesn't defeat him, but he goes the distance. So that's a win for him, That's my favorite movie.
Yeah.
But so yeah, you're thinking about that. Like in a historic one, the external is, you're giving the information and we're learning about rinks and we're going through this whole journey of history. But then you have this, why do we care about it? And it's expressed through multiple setups and payoffs through the characters and the places. So that by the time you see, things being closed, you're just like, no, how can they close? And then when you see new ones coming back, you're like, yes, and you want to feel those things when you're watching something. And then that's what inspires people to look into it more after the film. And, so it is a journey.
That's amazing. As a filmmaker, whatever you do, especially if it's a passion project, but whatever you do, you're putting, everything in there and it affects you as a filmmaker a certain way as well. My question, especially for All Skate being such a personal thing for you, speaking with, the emotional and insight, what have you learned out of making this film personally? And what have you personally taken away? Every filmmaker takes away certain thing from making a film, but personally, I want to know on your end, being so involved, this was part of your life growing up. What have you taken away from this process?
I just wanted to do the topic justice and just like make something that people who were there with me were proud of. And I think I feel that way for everything. And I'll give you an example with the Stuntwomen documentary.
Yeah.
So this is about women who are doing stunts in Hollywood. And same thing, we went through the whole history that at the beginning of cinema, women were doing stunts in films. They were riding horses and jumping onto moving trains and all these things. And then there were all the ups and downs of men putting on and all this stuff and just some of these challenges. And when I had the first sort of early screenings of that movie, one of the stunt women came to the screening and she came up to do the Q&A with me. And she said, she was very emotional. And she said, a lot of people have talked about wanting to make a movie like this or wanted to do one. She said, but you did it. And this is who we really are. And this is how we really feel. And When she said that, I knew I had done it right. Because you want the people that the film is most about to feel like you've done it justice. You know, like I said earlier, I'm making a film, but it's people's lives and livelihood, and you're telling their story. And so when I get to this one about, roller skating, and it's been my family's business, it's not just me. It is my mom and my brother and my sister, my cousin and her dad who ran the rink and everybody around it. And so when we just did this screening, previous screening of the unfinished film at the Lake County Film Festival, because my family's rink was in Lake County, a lot of the people who skated there and my uncle and, people involved that were around, that were in some of the old pictures that were in the film, actually came there to see it. And so that's kind of an important step is, do those people feel like you got it right? And there were so many people there that, yeah, just seemed really happy with it. There was one person there who was one of our floor guards who had been around since the beginning. He was, friends with my grandfather, friends with my dad, friends with my uncle. And he told me afterwards, he said, I kind of knew you were working on this. I kind of had an expectation. I thought I thought I might like it because I was there or whatever. But he was like, what you put together, this like 1,000 times exceeded my expectations. It was really good. Not just, for those of us who were there, it was, like it had that aspect of reminiscing, but not just for us, for everybody who, went to rinks. And so that was really nice to hear. And then my uncle, who I think when I started making it, didn't know what I was doing, didn't want to necessarily be in it because he's very shy. For him to feel happy, like I got it right, that's what I wanted to do. That makes me happy. So I feel like the content is right, and now I just need to get the money to do these extra steps
That's
and
all.
get it completely done.
Is there anything that you want to say as far as the release date for this and further things that you're working on? I know you're working on a narrative film, a final trip. If you want to go into that at all, we're talking like the future of this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is interesting because yeah, I showed the film without it being 100% done, but it's because I felt like it showed what the film is going to be. There's a few things I need to iron out with final score and a few clips. And I actually, when I was in Chicago, I shot some things that I know I'm going to substitute in the film that are better than what I've got. And I'll keep doing that till the end. I do that with all my documentaries. If there's things I come across that like, oh, that would be better than what I've got, then I'll still swap it out while I can. Since I edit, I can do that. I know there's a few things I'm going to swap out, but mostly it's just figuring out how to raise the money. And I'm in a good position because I have a track record with my previous films, and this is kind of in a similar ballpark like we've been talking about. So I feel confident I can circle back to people who knew about this when it was at more of an idea stage, and now I can show them this is where it's at. Do you want to get involved now? Maybe they didn't in the beginning when it didn't have a shape, but now that you can really see what it is, people have more confidence then. Like, oh, this is it. Now I see it. Now I don't have to imagine what you were going to make. Now here it is. And also, I've had very good success with just critical reviews and audience reviews and awards and distribution being successful. So I have a lot going into this next step. And I'll circle back to some of the distributors where I have other films. And my goal is just to get it out there into the world. I would like to do some more in-person screenings, partnering, maybe do screenings at theaters that are near the rinks, especially some of the rinks that were featured in the film. Kind of like we did there with my family's rink. I would love to do a Portland screening and get the Oaks rink involved to maybe help co-sponsor that or do something there. I would probably do the same near the Guptills Arena, the Skate Reflections down in Florida, and try to do things like that where we're going to have publicity type events and screenings to help get the word out. But mostly I need to circle back to people that I've talked to about this and distributors, and maybe I'll get the money, maybe I'll pre-sell it. I don't know the answer to that because this is why I wanted to say this. Every film takes its own path.
Okay.
And I think if you're thinking about that from the start and have realistic expectations and you're engaging with your audience, um, I've built an audience because I've, in my going attractions branding, I did drive-ins, I did movie palaces. This is technically the third one in that group, history of roller skating and rinks. And people who like drive-ins and went to movie palaces also skated. So it's a lot of the same audience, but then it's going to be a slightly different audience because of the topic of skating. It doesn't fit as naturally into playing in theaters. Like when I make films about drive-ins, drive-ins want to play it. When I make films about movie palaces, they want to play it. Skating's slightly different. There's not like a built-in exhibition, although a lot of rinks have video screens, so maybe some might. We'll see. I'm working also with sponsors. I've got some skate companies involved. I'm working with the National Museum of Roller Skating, so they might want to include pieces of it or clips or screen it. So this is something for everybody working on documentaries that you're thinking of, where it's going to go, and you're engaging those potential partners, early as you're making it so that they know it's coming, and then you're showing them, like I showed the museum the rougher cut, even rougher than what you guys saw, because it was like, here it is, and then after they saw the cut and knew what I was doing, they're like, oh, we've got a treasure trove of speed skating photos or a roller derby photos. They were like, here, have all these. So sometimes by engaging different groups, they're going to help you make the film better. So I'm kind of at that phase right now. But yeah, I hope I can get it done and get it out into the world later this year, so it'll be on streamers and everything like that. But yeah, it's a tough road. You can make documentaries for less. There's some things that you have to spend money on. All these things that I'm listing, and then you have to think about who the audience is and how to get it to them. And it's kind of different for every film, and the ways to do it seem to be evolving every day. For skating, people mentioned this in the film a few times about how skating is really big in Europe and Italy. There's a big skate event annually in Barcelona, and one of my former current distributors that I mentioned I was making this film, he's like, oh, there's going to be an international audience for that. I'm like, you're right. Skating is really big in Italy and other places around the world. So he kind of knew that. So there might be international sales potential for this topic. So these are all the things you're kind of thinking about, is who needs to see it, and at what step in the process do they need to see it. And, we have this idea that you need to totally, there was an older world where you had to like totally finish a film and go to a film festival, not show it to anyone until you get there, and then the buyers see it. And that model basically mostly doesn't exist anymore. And it is about that audience engagement and finding those people who are going to be your champions within the topic. And so you are showing some of those people, whether it's through social media, you're showing them like, oh, I'm here shooting this part, I'm this, because you're starting to build that interest earlier about what that is and build the anticipation. And so for me, on the total timeline of this movie, that screening was great because now I've showed it to an audience. It was well received. So now how can I build off of that to the next things that need to happen? And it can happen out of order, nowadays. So yeah, it's really unique for everyone. So I can't really give the way to do it, but just to, be thinking about that, engaging people all the way along the way is so important nowadays.
I like that because each project has a life of its own. It's its own thing. After people watch All Skate, what do you want them walking away with? I suppose is a good concept. Feeling, mindset. To me, what I walked away with, you start just thinking of these memories. And I saw people watching your movie before and after. You see like the childlike family memories, fond memories pop up. So what do you want as a filmmaker when people see this film in particular, people walk away with?
I think all my films uh, that are on this topic, the going attractions, as I've traveled the country visiting drive-ins, movie palaces, roller rinks, bowling alleys, amusement parks, it has allowed me to really see the geography of where they were relative to towns, and also kind of the impacts. Towns where I've gone to look at, the remains of a drive-in, that's wreckage or has been abandoned or whatever, or a roller rink that is no longer a roller rink, now it's a Goodwill or whatever it might be. I feel like the message for people overall in all my films is recognizing that these community based activities and institutions that we all grew up with, that were pervasive, were very important to the fabric of communities, to raising the kids, to not being isolated, to having, sometimes people call them third places, besides your work and family, to go and congregate, know your neighbors, and let off some steam and have a good time. They're pleasure driven. They're very, very fun. But then the next layer below that is they're very important to communities. And so we've gotten into a place now where there's less and less of these places that I like to talk about. And I want people to recognize, when the next one's going to close, or, when these things are happening, people need to think about the longer term effects on the community, that a lot of things that are purely driven by financial reasons are not always the best things in the long term for the communities. And people need to think about these things and value these things. I think we're seeing a lot of the side effects with young people. So just really taking it to that personal level in your local community. What are you valuing? What choices are being made? Are you patronizing these places? Are you going to them and supporting them? They're family-owned businesses in almost every case. And, if you make them just this memory, that's great. But if you go and support them and introduce the new generations in your family, then they're going to have that momentum to continue. You have to support the places and recognize, like I said, they're family businesses. They're not corporations. They're not Walmart's coming in. Like it's the antithesis of that. When Walmart's come in, they kind of, devastate the rest of all the small businesses, and, and then pay lower wages and all the stuff that we read about, so think about your communities, the people in your communities, that we need to talk to each other. We need to engage with each other. And part of why we're doing that less now is probably because we have less places to do that. And the more places we have to do that, the better off we're going to be.
That's perfect. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Methods of Fiction. To hear more insights from filmmaking and entertainment industry professionals, subscribe to our video podcast on YouTube. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to follow us there as well. We look forward to having you join us again on the next episode.